Ladies and gentlemen, the most painful moment is not when someone tells you they no longer need you. It is the moment you finally believe them, turn around and walk away, only to discover that your absence becomes the very thing they cannot survive. They were certain they could live without you. They imagined that your silence would be temporary, your distance would collapse, and your heart would eventually lead you back to the same door where you had been neglected. They believed your love was too loyal to leave, your patience too deep to expire, and your hope too persistent to die. But then something unexpected happened. You stopped explaining. You stopped waiting. You stopped returning. And the person who once treated your presence as ordinary suddenly began to experience your absence as unbearable. This is one of the strangest contradictions of human psychology. People frequently fail to understand the value of what is present because presence creates familiarity, and familiarity creates the illusion of permanence. When someone is always available, always forgiving, always understanding, and always willing to repair what others have broken, their devotion can begin to disappear into the background. It becomes like the air in a room, essential, yet unnoticed until it is gone. They do not necessarily stop benefiting from your presence. They simply stop consciously appreciating it. Your kindness becomes expected. Your forgiveness becomes predictable. Your emotional labor becomes invisible. Your sacrifices become part of the routine. And because you continue to stay, they begin to believe that staying is your nature rather than your choice. They forget that every patient heart has a boundary. They forget that every loyal person has a breaking point. They forget that love can be profound and still decide to leave. They assume that because you endured yesterday, you will endure tomorrow. They confuse your understanding with weakness and your compassion with dependency. They imagine that you remain because you cannot survive without them, never considering that perhaps you remain because you still believe in what the connection could become. But hope is not infinite. Eventually, a moment arrives when the soul can no longer continue betraying itself merely to preserve a relationship. There comes a point when staying hurts more than leaving. There comes a point when explaining yourself feels like begging someone to acknowledge what they have deliberately ignored. There comes a point when love no longer feels like love because it requires you to abandon your dignity in order to receive basic consideration. And when that moment arrives, something changes inside you. Not dramatically, not loudly, not in a way they immediately recognize. It often begins quietly. You stop arguing because you no longer expect to be understood. You stop asking questions because the patterns have already given you the answers. You stop demanding reassurance because reassurance without consistent action has become meaningless. You stop reacting because emotional exhaustion has replaced emotional urgency. From the outside you may appear calm, but internally a separation has already begun. Your body may still be present, but your soul is withdrawing. This is why people are often shocked when someone finally walks away. They claim that the departure happened suddenly. They say there was no warning. They insist they never knew the situation was serious. But the truth is that the departure rarely begins on the day the person physically leaves. It begins during every conversation in which their feelings are dismissed. It begins each time their loyalty is exploited. It begins each night they lie awake wondering why loving someone has made them feel so alone. It begins every time they forgive an injury that is later repeated. By the time they walk away, they have often left emotionally many times before. They stayed long enough to confirm that nothing would change. They gave enough chances to silence the guilt. They endured enough disappointment to know that leaving was not impulsive. Their departure is not the beginning of the ending. It is merely the visible conclusion of an ending that has been unfolding within them for months, perhaps years. And yet the other person rarely understands this process because they were comfortable. Comfort dulls awareness. When your presence continuously protects someone from the consequences of their behavior, they have little motivation to change. Your forgiveness relieves their guilt. Your availability rescues them from loneliness. Your emotional strength carries what they refuse to carry themselves. Without realizing it, you may become the structure that allows their immaturity to continue. They hurt you, but you repair the connection. They withdraw, but you pursue understanding. They create distance, but you restore intimacy. They become careless, but you compensate with greater effort. They learn that no matter how little they contribute, you will somehow keep the bond alive. And because you repeatedly save the relationship, they never experience the full consequence of endangering it. This is not because you are foolish. It is because you love deeply. But love without boundaries can become a shelter for another person's unconsciousness. A person does not awaken merely because you explain the pain they have caused. Sometimes they awaken only when the person who absorbed that pain is no longer there. Your departure removes the cushion between their actions and their consequences. Suddenly they must sit with the silence they created. They must experience the distance they once imposed on you. They must carry the emotional weight you carried alone. They must confront the emptiness your presence had been quietly filling. This is when the truth begins to appear. At first they may still feel confident. They may tell themselves that your departure does not matter. They may present themselves as unaffected, liberated, or even relieved. They may become louder on social media, more social in public, and more determined to prove that life continues perfectly without you. But appearances often protect the ego from realities it is not ready to face. The ego rarely admits loss immediately. To admit that your absence hurts would require them to acknowledge that your presence mattered. To acknowledge that you mattered would force them to confront the way they treated you. To confront the way they treated you would awaken guilt, regret, and shame. Therefore, the ego creates defenses. It minimizes. It distracts. It blames. It replaces. It performs happiness. But what is denied does not disappear. It moves into the shadow. The shadow contains everything a person refuses to recognize about themselves. Their neediness, their fear, their selfishness, their vulnerability, their dependence, their guilt, and their unresolved longing. When you leave, the feelings they denied do not vanish. They descend beneath conscious awareness and begin influencing their thoughts, choices, and emotions from the darkness. They may dream about you. They may become irritated when your name is mentioned. They may compare new people to you without admitting it. They may revisit old messages, photographs, places, and memories. They may feel a sudden ache when a song reminds them of a moment they once considered insignificant. This is the language of the unconscious. The unconscious does not respect the stories the ego tells. A person can say, "I do not care," while their behavior reveals obsession. They can say, "I have moved on," while searching for you in every new connection. They can say, "It was for the best," while secretly hoping you will return. The conscious mind can construct 1,000 explanations, but the unconscious continues to reveal what remains unresolved. Your absence may activate emotions they never permitted themselves to feel while you were present. While you were there, they could postpone appreciation. There would always be another conversation, another apology, another chance, another day to treat you better. Your continued presence allowed them to live in the illusion of unlimited time. But when you walk away and remain gone, time changes its meaning. Possibility becomes memory. Opportunity becomes regret. Your voice becomes something they can no longer hear whenever they wish. Your kindness becomes something they can no longer summon when life becomes difficult. Your attention becomes something they can no longer assume belongs to them. And this is when they discover that what they considered ordinary was never ordinary at all. They begin to recognize the details, the way you remembered what mattered to them, the way you understood their silence, the way you protected their vulnerabilities, the way you encouraged them when they doubted themselves, the way you listened without making everything about you, the way you saw potential in them even when they could not see it in themselves, the way you stayed through versions of them that were difficult to love. These things may have seemed small when they were available every day, but once removed, they become enormous. Human beings often recognize emotional value through contrast. We understand warmth after experiencing cold. We understand peace after chaos. We understand loyalty after betrayal. We understand presence after absence. Your departure creates contrast. It reveals the difference between being surrounded by people and being genuinely understood. It reveals the difference between receiving attention and receiving devotion. It reveals the difference between temporary excitement and emotional safety. They may meet new people. They may laugh, socialize, flirt, and attempt to build something new. But newness cannot automatically replace depth. A new person does not carry the history you shared. They do not understand the unspoken language that developed between you. They do not know the wounds you learned to approach gently. They do not possess the patience you cultivated through years of experience. They do not recognize the subtle changes in mood that you could detect without a word. And so the person who believed you could easily be replaced begins to encounter a disturbing truth. People are replaceable in function, but not in meaning. Someone else may answer their calls. Someone else may sit across from them at dinner. Someone else may offer affection. But no one can recreate your exact consciousness, your particular form of care, your emotional rhythm, your way of seeing them. Every human connection is psychologically unique. When it is lost, another connection may eventually be formed, but it will not be the same connection. The tragedy is that some people search for the same feeling in different faces. They pursue individuals who resemble fragments of you. They search for your patience in one person, your humor in another, your loyalty in someone else, and your emotional depth in yet another. But the whole they once possessed cannot be reconstructed from scattered parts. They thought they wanted freedom from the responsibility of valuing you. What they received was freedom from the experience of having you. And these are not the same thing. At first, freedom may feel exciting. There are no difficult conversations, no accountability, and no need to consider the emotional needs of another person. But freedom without connection can slowly turn into emptiness. They begin to understand that your expectations were not imprisonment. Your questions were not control. Your desire for communication was not excessive neediness. You were asking for mutuality. You were asking them to participate in the relationship they claimed to value. You were asking them to meet you emotionally rather than merely benefit from your devotion. But accountability feels threatening to someone who wants love without responsibility. Such a person may accuse you of asking for too much when you are actually asking the wrong person for something basic. They may describe your emotional needs as pressure because they are accustomed to receiving without reciprocating. They may call your boundaries dramatic because your lack of boundaries was convenient for them. Then you leave, and they enter relationships in which the same patience is not offered. The next person does not tolerate what you tolerated. The next person does not explain as gently as you did. The next person does not remain after repeated disrespect. Suddenly they see themselves through a new mirror. They begin to realize that you were not difficult. You were deeply invested. You were not overly emotional. You were emotionally present. You were not demanding perfection. You were asking for consistency. But by the time this understanding arrives, you may have already crossed an internal threshold. This is what they never expected. They thought your love guaranteed your return. They believed missing them would eventually overpower your self-respect. They assumed loneliness would make you forget the reasons you left. They did not understand that you had already experienced loneliness while standing beside them. The loneliness after leaving may be painful, but it is honest. The loneliness within a relationship is far more destructive because it makes you question your own reality. When you walk away, you may grieve. You may miss them. You may have moments when your body aches for the familiarity of their presence. But missing someone does not mean leaving was wrong. The heart can mourn what the soul knows it has outgrown. This is an essential distinction. You can love a person and still recognize that the relationship is damaging you. You can remember beautiful moments and still refuse to return to a destructive pattern. You can forgive someone internally and still deny them further access to your life. Love does not require endless self-abandonment. In fact, sometimes the most psychologically mature expression of love is separation. Not separation intended to punish, not silence designed to manipulate, not distance created to provoke pursuit, but a genuine departure born from the recognition that remaining would destroy something essential within you. Walking away becomes an act of individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming psychologically whole. It requires you to separate your authentic self from roles, expectations, attachments, and unconscious patterns that keep you fragmented. Perhaps you became the rescuer. Perhaps you believed your value came from being needed. Perhaps you tolerated neglect because being chosen, even inconsistently, felt safer than being alone. Perhaps you were not only attached to the person, you were attached to the fantasy of who they could become. You loved their potential. You loved the rare moments when they became emotionally available. You built an entire future around glimpses, and those glimpses kept you invested through long periods of disappointment. Intermittent affection can create powerful attachment. When warmth is inconsistent, the mind becomes preoccupied with recovering it. You begin to work harder for what should be given freely. You interpret every small act of kindness as proof that change is coming. You wait for the exceptional moment to become the normal pattern. But a relationship must be judged by its repeated reality, not its occasional promise. Walking away means accepting reality without decorating it with potential. It means saying, I will no longer build my life around who you might become. This acceptance is painful because fantasy can be more comforting than truth. Truth says they knew you were hurting and still did not change. Truth says your love could not complete their psychological work for them. Truth says you may never receive the apology, explanation, or recognition you deserve. Truth says closure may not come from their words. It may come from your decision to stop waiting for those words. When you accept this, your energy begins to return. For a long time, your energy was directed outward. You watched their moods. You analyzed their behavior. You searched for signs of change. You rehearsed conversations. You wondered how to become easier to love. You questioned whether you were asking for too much. But once you leave, that energy can slowly be redirected toward your own inner life. You begin asking different questions. Why did I remain where I was repeatedly unseen? Why did I confuse endurance with love? Why did I believe I had to earn consistency? Why was I more afraid of losing them than losing myself? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are transformative. It is easier to focus entirely on what another person did wrong. But healing requires more than identifying the villain. It requires understanding the unconscious wound within you that accepted the situation for so long. This does not make their behavior your fault. Responsibility and blame are not the same. You are not responsible for their neglect, dishonesty, or emotional immaturity, but you are responsible for understanding why your boundaries failed to protect you. Perhaps you learned in childhood that love must be earned. Perhaps affection was inconsistent, so emotional unpredictability feels familiar. Perhaps you became highly sensitive to the needs of others because your own needs were ignored. Perhaps you learned to maintain peace by suppressing your truth. Then, in adulthood, you unconsciously entered relationships where the same pattern could be repeated. The psyche often seeks not what is healthy, but what is familiar. This is why walking away is not merely leaving another person. It is leaving an old identity. You are leaving the identity that begs for recognition, the identity that waits to be chosen, the identity that mistakes suffering for loyalty, the identity that remains available to people who offer only fragments. This death of identity can feel terrifying. For some time, you may not know who you are without the relationship. You may feel emptiness where anxiety once lived. You may mistake peace for boredom because chaos had become emotionally stimulating. But gradually, you begin to discover yourself beneath the attachment. You remember interests you abandoned. You reconnect with people you neglected. You hear your intuition more clearly. You sleep without waiting for a message. You wake without immediately checking whether someone has decided to value you. Your nervous system begins to understand that peace is not rejection. Silence is not danger. Solitude is not abandonment. Your life begins to expand beyond the narrow emotional world of the relationship. And while you are healing, they may begin to feel your absence more intensely. This is often when they return. Not always because they have transformed. Sometimes they return because your departure disrupted their comfort. They miss your availability. They miss the validation you provided. They miss knowing that someone would always answer. They miss the emotional home you created even though they refuse to maintain it. Their return may sound convincing. They may speak the language you begged to hear. They may finally acknowledge your worth. They may promise that everything will be different. And part of you may ache to believe them because these words represent the future you once wanted. But regret is not the same as transformation. Missing you is not the same as being capable of loving you well. Real change requires more than emotional panic. A person can become desperate when access is removed without becoming psychologically mature. They may want you back because they cannot tolerate the consequence of losing you, not because they have developed the capacity to protect your heart. You must observe the difference between a wounded ego and an awakened soul. A wounded ego says, "Come back because I cannot bear that you left me." An awakened soul says, "I understand how my behavior harmed you, and I am committed to changing whether or not you return." A wounded ego focuses on recovering access. An awakened soul accepts responsibility. A wounded ego makes urgent promises. An awakened soul demonstrates sustained action. A wounded ego fears replacement. An awakened soul confronts its shadow. Do not confuse their fear of losing you with their readiness to value you. This is one of the most dangerous moments after walking away. The recognition you once desperately wanted may finally arrive, but it may arrive too late and for the wrong reasons. Your task is not to punish them. Your task is to remain loyal to what your suffering taught you. If you return, let it not be because words temporarily relieved your loneliness. Let it be only because reality has changed in a consistent, observable, and mature way. And if reality has not changed, allow your departure to remain complete. You do not owe permanent access to someone simply because they finally understood what they lost. Understanding your value after destroying the connection does not restore the connection automatically. Consequences are not cruelty. Boundaries are not revenge. Silence is not manipulation when it is used to protect your peace rather than control another person. You are allowed to become unavailable to those who became conscious of your worth only after losing the benefits of your love. There is a profound difference between being loved and being used as emotional regulation. Some people do not miss you as a person. They miss how you made them feel about themselves. You made them feel important, desired, understood, safe, capable, forgiven. When you leave, they lose the reflection of themselves that existed in your eyes. They may call this love, but sometimes it is dependence on your validation. True love is interested in your inner world. It cares about the cost you paid to remain. It does not merely grieve the comfort it lost. It grieves the pain it caused. Ask yourself, when they return, are they speaking about your suffering or only their loneliness? Are they concerned with rebuilding trust, or are they demanding immediate forgiveness? Do they respect your boundaries, or do they treat your boundaries as obstacles? Do they want to understand you, or do they only want relief from regret? These questions reveal whether the return is about love or access. Ladies and gentlemen, there is another truth that must be spoken. Sometimes the person never returns. Sometimes they never apologize. Sometimes they continue pretending that losing you had no effect. Sometimes pride becomes stronger than honesty. Do not make your healing dependent upon visible regret. The purpose of walking away is not to make them chase you. The purpose is to stop abandoning yourself. If you leave only to provoke pursuit, you remain psychologically attached. Your body has walked away, but your identity is still waiting for their reaction. You watch whether they view your stories. You wonder whether they ask about you. You hope they will suffer enough to validate your worth. But your worth does not increase because someone regrets losing you, and it does not decrease because someone fails to recognize what they lost. A person's inability to value you reflects the limits of their consciousness, not the limits of your value. This is difficult to accept because rejection often awakens the belief that we were insufficient. The mind asks, if I were more attractive, more patient, more successful, less emotional, or easier to understand, would they have loved me differently? But this question assumes that perfect performance can heal another person's inability to connect. It cannot. You could become everything they claimed they wanted, and an unconscious person could still find a way to neglect you, because the problem was never simply what you provided. The problem was what they were capable of receiving. A closed heart can stand in the sunlight and still complain of darkness. You cannot force someone to develop emotional depth through the intensity of your devotion. Your love may invite transformation, but it cannot perform transformation on their behalf. This is why your departure can become sacred. It returns responsibility to its rightful owner. You stop carrying their growth. You stop translating their silence. You stop protecting them from the truth about themselves. You let them encounter the life their choices have created. Perhaps they will awaken. Perhaps they will repeat the same pattern with someone else. Perhaps losing you will become the event that changes them. Perhaps pride will prevent them from learning anything. But their journey is no longer yours to control. Your journey is to become someone who no longer negotiates with disrespect. Someone who does not require another person's regret in order to believe in their own significance. Someone who can love deeply without disappearing inside love. Someone who understands that compassion must include compassion for the self. You must learn to give yourself what you kept asking them to provide. Attention, consistency, protection, patience, honesty. You must stop treating yourself the way they treated you. Do not continue their neglect through your own inner dialogue. Do not repeat their rejection by criticizing your body, your emotions, your needs, or your past. Do not abandon yourself simply because someone else did. This is where true recovery begins. Not when they return, not when they apologize, not when they admit they were wrong. Recovery begins when you become a safe place for yourself. You begin honoring your emotions without letting them govern every decision. You begin recognizing your needs without feeling ashamed. You begin setting boundaries before resentment accumulates. You begin listening when your intuition whispers rather than waiting until pain screams. You begin understanding that losing a connection is sometimes the price of recovering your soul. And then one day something remarkable happens. You think of them without collapsing. The memory remains, but it no longer controls your nervous system. You can appreciate what was beautiful without denying what was harmful. You can wish them well without inviting them back. You can understand their wounds without volunteering to be wounded by them again. This is integration. You are no longer fighting the past. You have absorbed its lesson. You have allowed the experience to deepen you without allowing it to define you. They may still believe they could live without you. Perhaps physically they can. Everyone continues living after loss. But living and remaining unchanged are different things. They may continue their life, yet carry the imprint of your absence. They may remember you whenever someone fails to understand them the way you did. They may feel your memory when they encounter the consequences of their emotional carelessness. They may realize, in a quiet room years later, that they once had something genuine and treated it as temporary. But you must not build your future around this possibility. Their regret belongs to them. Your freedom belongs to you. Do not remain emotionally imprisoned by the fantasy of the day they finally understand. Perhaps they already understand. Perhaps they never will. Either way, your life is asking you to move forward. There are people you have not yet met who will not require your disappearance in order to appreciate your presence. There are relationships in which communication will not feel like combat. There are hearts that will not interpret your tenderness as weakness. There are people capable of recognizing your value while they still have access to you. But you must become willing to leave spaces that train you to expect less. You must stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You must stop romanticizing inconsistency. You must stop calling emotional survival a relationship. Healthy love may initially feel unfamiliar because it does not activate the same anxiety. It does not make you constantly question where you stand. It does not alternate affection and withdrawal to keep you emotionally dependent. It does not require you to prove your worth every day. Healthy love is not perfect, but it is participatory. Both people repair. Both people listen. Both people take responsibility. Both people remain curious about each other's inner world. And most importantly, both people understand that love is not only an emotion, it is a pattern of behavior. The person who lost you may have felt love, but feeling love is insufficient when behavior repeatedly communicates disregard. A person may love you according to their capacity and still be incapable of building a healthy relationship. Recognizing this allows you to release resentment without returning to dysfunction. You do not need to decide that they were entirely evil. You only need to accept that what they offered was not enough for the life your soul requires. This is maturity. Maturity does not ask, who was completely right? It asks, what pattern existed? What did it cost me? And what must I learn? Perhaps they taught you what happens when you ignore yourself. Perhaps they taught you that chemistry cannot replace character. Perhaps they taught you that promises without action create psychological confusion. Perhaps they taught you that the person you are afraid to lose may already be costing you your identity. These lessons are painful, but they are valuable when integrated consciously. Do not allow suffering to remain meaningless. Transform it into discernment. Transform betrayal into boundaries. Transform abandonment into self-commitment. Transform grief into wisdom. Transform the ending into an initiation. The relationship may have ended, but your deeper life may be beginning. You are no longer standing outside someone's emotional door, asking to be invited into a space your love helped build. You are no longer trying to convince a person of your humanity. You are no longer shrinking your needs to fit their limitations. You are walking toward yourself. And yes, they may finally feel the weight of your absence. They may finally understand that your presence was not guaranteed. They may discover that the person they assumed would always stay became the person strong enough to leave. They may regret every moment they made you feel replaceable. But the greatest victory is not their regret. It is your awakening. The greatest victory is that you no longer need their recognition. The greatest victory is that you did not allow their inability to love you properly to become your inability to love yourself. You walked away not because your feelings disappeared, but because your self-respect finally became stronger than your attachment. This is courage. Courage is not the absence of longing. It is choosing what protects your soul, even while your heart still aches. Courage is deleting the message you wanted to send. It is surviving the night when loneliness tells you to return. It is remembering the entire pattern when nostalgia shows you only the beautiful moments. It is refusing temporary comfort when you know it will lead back to permanent pain. Every time you choose yourself, the unconscious pattern weakens. Every boundary creates a new inner structure. Every day, without returning, becomes evidence that you can survive what you once believed would destroy you. And gradually, the person who walked away trembling becomes someone who can no longer imagine accepting so little. This is the transformation they never anticipated. They believed you would remain broken by losing them. Instead, losing them returned you to yourself. They thought you would spend your life waiting. Instead, you built a life that no longer contained a place for their inconsistency. They thought your love made you weak. They did not understand that the same heart capable of loving deeply is also capable of leaving permanently once it becomes conscious. There is nothing more powerful than a person who has integrated their pain. Such a person cannot be easily manipulated by promises because they observe patterns. They cannot be controlled through withdrawal because they are no longer terrified of solitude. They cannot be kept through minimal effort because they have experienced the cost of accepting crumbs. They no longer chase closure from those who created confusion. They create closure through conscious decision. And so, ladies and gentlemen, when someone believes they can live without you, do not argue. Do not perform your value. Do not exhaust yourself trying to make them imagine your absence. Let reality teach what your words could not. Walk away with dignity. Walk away without cruelty. Walk away without turning your departure into a performance. Walk away because you have finally accepted that love must include respect, reciprocity, and responsibility. They may celebrate at first. Let them. They may replace you quickly. Let them. They may pretend you never mattered. Let them. Your task is not to manage the story they tell. Your task is to remain aligned with the truth you discovered. In time, appearances fade. Distractions become quiet. Newness becomes ordinary, and the psyche begins to compare. That is when they may remember the one who loved them before they understood how rare such love was. They may search for your presence in places where it no longer exists. They may reach for the emotional safety they once neglected. They may finally understand that you were not asking for too much. You were asking them to become conscious. But by then, you may no longer be waiting. You may be standing in a life built from the pieces you once thought were ruined. You may be loved by people who do not need to lose you to see you. You may look back and understand that the departure that broke your heart also broke the unconscious pattern that had imprisoned your life. And perhaps this is the deepest meaning of the experience. You were not abandoned by life. You were redirected toward wholeness. You did not merely lose a person. You lost an illusion. The illusion that your value depended on being chosen by someone who could not recognize it. The illusion that patience would eventually produce reciprocity. The illusion that love alone could transform another human being. What remains after the illusion dies is truth. You are worthy before anyone regrets losing you. You are valuable before anyone walks away. You are complete before anyone returns. And you are allowed to choose a life in which your presence is honored without first becoming an absence. So let them believe they could live without you. Let them discover what that life feels like. Let them sit with the silence left by the voice they once ignored. Let them remember the devotion they once treated as ordinary. But do not stand still waiting for the lesson to reach them. Keep walking. Walk toward peace. Walk toward integrity. Walk toward relationships that do not require self-betrayal. Walk toward the person you were always meant to become. Because the real story is not that they thought they could live without you until you walked away. The real story is that you thought you could not live without them until walking away proved that you could. And not only could you live, you could heal, you could grow, you could awaken, you could become whole. You could create a life so deeply rooted in self-respect that the person who once made you question your worth would no longer recognize the strength of the person standing before them. Your departure may become their greatest regret, but your awakening will become your greatest liberation. And when you finally understand this, you will no longer ask whether they miss you. You will ask why you ever believed you had to disappear in order to be valued. Then you will make a quiet promise to yourself, never again will I remain where my soul must beg to be seen. Never again will I confuse being needed with being loved. Never again will I sacrifice my dignity to preserve someone else's comfort. Never again will I wait for loss to teach another person what my presence should have already revealed. You will carry this promise forward, not as bitterness, but as wisdom. And from that day onward, your love will remain deep, but it will no longer be blind. Your heart will remain open, but it will also be protected. Your compassion will remain strong, but it will include you. That is the balance of a conscious life. That is the beginning of wholeness. That is the moment you stop being the person they thought would always return and become the person who finally returned to themselves.